Hello everyone. In this tutorial we're gonna do the part that is easy and is fun, and after this we're gonna be able to pose our creatures. What we're gonna do here is to set the pivot point. You might have noticed that, for example, let's say hip. Hip is most of the times for just moving the object. We're not gonna be rotating the object around the hip, right? But for example, let's say torso. We want this creature to bend like this, okay? Well, it does the bend fine, but the thing is, it's not bending from the correct pivot point, right? And we have done this for so many objects before. Hopefully it's not going to be a problem for us to do it now. The thing is, we adjusted the pivot point for objects. Now we're adjusting the pivot point for groups, okay? So you can see that groups, like any other object that gets created in Maya, by default they have their pivot point at the center of the project. If I hit W, you can see that it is not at the center of the project. That's something. Probably I have moved this torso like forward, and then I freeze the transformation. That's why the center of, the pivot point is not at the center of the project. Adjusting the pivot point at the center of the project is the easiest deal possible, okay? What you can do is that you can create like a locator here. I always have this locator in my scene. I love locators, okay? So to create a locator, you just go to create, and you go to here, locator. Locators are going to be like any other object, are going to be created at the center of the grid, and the good thing about them is that they're not going to be rendered, they're not geometry, they're just a locator, okay? And you can always, if you want to snap the pivot point or any other object to the center of the project, like here, if I want to have the pivot point for the hip to be hip group, actually, not the hip itself. The hip itself, I just set it the pivot point to be at the center. But if I want to adjust any pivot point to the center of the project, I can just click on that object or group and it's better to adjust the pivot point while you want to move stuff, okay, with the move manipulator. So hitting, let's say I'm in rotation, I rather have it in the move mode, okay? I hit W to go to move mode, holding down D, I'm gonna grab this middle thingy, and to snap it while holding down D to be in the change pivot point mode, I'm holding down V for snap, okay? D is for changing the pivot point, V is for snap, okay? To snap it to this point, and that's all. If I click on the hip, now the pivot point is right at the center of the project, okay? For most objects, you don't want the pivot point to be at the center of the project. You want the pivot point to be where they're going to be rotating, right? Like for example, in this hip group, I want it to rotate from, for the torso group, I want it to rotate from, let's say, heading down for right here in this point. I want it to be rotated from here. It all depends on your creature and how do you want them to move, okay? So to do that, one thing you can do is for the objects, it doesn't matter if you have grouped all of your objects inside the groups, you're not using like the geometry to move them, it doesn't matter where the pivot point is. Because you're not going to be rotating your objects, you're going to be rotating groups, okay? So it doesn't matter if the pivot point for this eye is at the center or it's at the center of the grid or whatever place that it is. It doesn't matter because it lives inside this head group, and that's how I want to rotate all of it, right? So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to go to each group and set the pivot points so they rotate in a correct manner, okay? So here I want to set the pivot point for the torso group. So if you want to, there's a way to isolate your selection in Maya. You can do it by going here, isolate selection. It means if I click on it, every other object are going to be hidden, and I can only see what I've selected, which in this case was the torso group, right? There's a hotkey for that. Let's just find it out. Let's see. Hotkey for isolate selection Maya. Okay. How to turn off isolate, Autodesk knowledge network. That's like would be my best bet to get the answer. Okay, so I can see here that it says, I don't want to give feedback. Oh, this is like for everything. That's gonna be hard. Toggle isolate selected in Maya. How to turn off selecting using keyboards. Okay, here we go. Go to solution. Somebody asked this question, so that's nice. How to turn off toggle isolate selection using keyboard. Problem solved with the shortcut Control-1. So I'm just gonna do the same. So I'm gonna do Control-1, and yeah, that's the shortcut for that, for this icon here. Okay, so now I want to adjust the pivot point. For the torso, I'm going to decide this point would be like the best candidate. I can always go back and change that, but for now I'm going to decide this is a good point for the pivot. So I'm going to click the torso group, not the torso, okay, the torso group, because that's what I'm going to use to rotate the torso part. Holding down D, I go to change pivot mode. Holding down V, I go to snap to point. Just gonna click and drag it until I get to the point that I want it to be snapped to. I release D and V. So now I'm gonna hit Control-1 so that I have everything in the scene. I'm gonna select the torso group. I'm gonna hit E on my keyboard. I'm gonna rotate this. Sounds good to me. And you move all the way to all the groups. Like for the neck, I'm just gonna isolate the selection, Control-1. For the group, for the neck group, I want it to be rotated from this point. Holding down D, holding down V, just gonna snap it right at the center. Make sure it's snapped at the right place. Well, even if it does, if it snaps here, you can always go grab it and say, here, I want you to be snapped here. And if your object doesn't have like this distinctive point that you can snap your like pivot point to, you just need to decide and eyeball something, okay? Control-1. So you get the idea, right? I'm gonna go to head. For the head, I'm just gonna isolate the selection. For the head, I want it to be moved over the center. It's just for the head, I'm gonna hit 4 to go to wireframe mode because I want to be able to see the, you know, where it connects to the neck. So for the head group, I'm just gonna hold down D, holding down V. I'm just gonna move it up here. I haven't decided yet. I'm just gonna leave it here and get close. So here I can see this would be like a good point to snap the pivot point. So holding down D, holding down V, I'm just gonna snap it here. Okay. Hitting 6 on the keyboard to go back to shaded and textured preview. I'm selecting the head group. Hitting E. Yeah, that looks fine. You again notice I'm not changing the pivot point for the head because I didn't use the head geometry for this hierarchy. I used the head group. Okay, I'm just gonna go down on every part and do the same thing for the arms. Let's just hit 4. Let's see, for the arms, I'm thinking Like my best bet would be to put the pivot point right at the center of the sphere. What do you think? I think that would be best, because the sphere, if you rotate them, it doesn't matter, right? They look the same on every direction if you rotate them from their center. That's the trick, right? So let's say you have a sphere, the pivot point is not at its center. Let's say the pivot point is here. Okay, I just changed the pivot point. Holding down, holding Q. Okay. So what you can do is that first you can center the pivot for that object. If it's a sphere, it's going to be exactly at the center of the sphere, right? If your object is not symmetrical, then the pivot point is going to be somewhere that is kind of hard to predict, but you can always go in and change that, like, you know, put the pivot point where you think would be the best, okay? So for this sphere, I want the pivot point to be at its center. So I'm just going to go to modify and do center pivot. Easy peasy, right? So now that this pivot point is at its center, I can go to arm group. And what I want to do here, instead of snapping the pivot point for the arm group to a point, I want it to match to this sphere pivot point. And we do that by matching their pivot points. That's easy, right? I'm going to select on the arm, and I'm going to select the sphere. Remember, the order of selection is important in Maya, okay? So the last object that you select is going to be the object that's, you know, that Maya is going to be, okay, I'm just going to set the pivot point to be here. If you do it the other way, first the sphere and then the group, then it's going to be grouped under, you know, the first pivot point. So my suggestion would be to be in the move mode, hit W so you can see where the pivot point is. Now I can see, okay, this is where I want the pivot point to be. I selected the group, then selected the sphere. Now I can just go to modify and do match transformation. And under this, I can see match pivots. So it's going to match the pivot point of the object that you selected first to the object that you selected second. Or you can, you know, grab a bunch of objects, like 10 objects, and then click on the last object. So Maya is going to adjust the pivot point of all those 10 or whatever number of objects to the last object that you selected. That's how it works, okay? You grab a bunch of objects, you select the object that you want to match the pivot point to, and then you're going to do modify, match transformation, and match pivots, okay? So I'm going to do the same here. And now if I click on the arm left, I can see that the pivot point is at the center of, sorry about that, at the center of this sphere, okay? So now I can just select, click on this group, hit E to move it, and it works. Isn't it awesome? It's so cool. I love posing characters. So you're gonna do the same for the left arm and also like the upper leg, lower leg. It's all about deciding where to put the pivot point. If there is like a point in the object that you think that would be the best candidate for putting the pivot point, you can just hold down V and snap the pivot point to that point. If there's not such a point, you can always match the pivot point to whatever object that is in that hierarchy that looks like the best candidate. Or you can just create a locator and put it in a place that you think would be the best option and just match the pivot points there. So you can do this a couple of times until you get the rotations that you want with the pivot points that is correct, okay? You're not changing geometry, you're not building up history, it's just changing the pivot point. Do it as many times as needed until you get the rotation for the parts in the correct manner, okay? So yeah, that's for this video. In the next one, I'm gonna show you how to smooth, not smooth, just soften and harden edges as needed.